camouflage. And one of the sharks that would eat you is that big shark in the upper left. That's a 6-gill shark, and that's not even fully grown. Those sharks can get to be about 24 feet long or more and live in the deep oceans. And so we have these sharks in the deep oceans, sharks like the oceanic white-tip in the lower right there that are in the kind of blue water, open ocean surface waters, sharks in coral reefs, and even sharks in the rivers that we'll talk a little bit about later. So bull sharks, for example, are one species that are perfectly at home in rivers. We also see a tremendous diversity of ways that sharks feed. So they aren't just top predators, and in fact the biggest sharks in the ocean eat the smallest prey. So sharks like the whale sharks and the basking shark here swim around with their mouths open, and they filter out small shrimp-like creatures from the plankton team. Mako sharks, a lot of sharks, their favorite foods are fish and squid, but we also have the small reef sharks that eat worms, crabs, and clams. Now, one of my favorite shark feeding techniques is the cookie cutter shark, and that's the one up there on the left. And see those kind of fleshy lips? They can actually use those lips to suck onto a whale or a dolphin, take a bite, and then they spin their body and they pull a scoop of flesh out that kind of looks like a cookie cutter. Probably the melon baller shark would be better, because that's kind of what they're doing. And so some of these whales and dolphins that dive deep under the water look like they have polka dots. Those aren't polka dots. Those are all the little scars from how many times they've been fed on by these cookie cutter sharks. They're kind of like vampire bats. Only a little bit, but very cool. How do sharks reproduce? Well, this is a really important question because this is one of the reasons that shark populations are in so much trouble around the world. And it's because, unlike most of the bony fish that just send out lots of eggs and sperm and can produce thousands or tens of thousands of young at a time, sharks may take 10, 20, 30, or 40 years till they're old enough to reproduce for the first time. And then females, they only have a couple pups every few years. Some sharks lay eggs like you see there, but they don't lay a ton. And then a lot of the sharks that we generally think of actually are born alive. And there may only be between 2 and maybe 12 pups born every other year. And a lot of these sharks you find swimming around in very shallow coastal waters. So like this lemon shark here. If you're a little shark, why would you want to hang out in shallow water? Any thoughts?
Stay away from the big ones.
Exactly. Stay away from the bigger sharks because hammerheads, bull sharks, tiger sharks' favorite food pretty much smaller sharks. So you want to be in this water here where there's enough food to eat, but you're not going to get eaten by a bigger shark. So I mentioned they reproduce slowly, and the latest estimate that we've made is that there are probably 100 million sharks killed in fisheries every year. The low end of that estimate, 70 million. The high end's about 260 million individuals. And when you have those fish reproducing so slowly, you can see why these populations might be in trouble. So this is way above the rate that sharks can be reproduced. So even though the populations in a lot of places are down 80% or more, we're continuing to drive the populations down, primarily because of demand for shark fin soup, which is a delicacy. And it's really hard to manage shark populations because a lot of these big species especially move long distances. So one of the tiger sharks we tagged in Australia swam all the way to South Africa. So when the sharks go across boundaries of countries and there's really no one looking out for what's being caught on the high seas, it's really hard to make sure we have the right catch limits. So we really need international and kind of regional cooperation for management. But before we even get to the management, we need to know a lot about sharks and their ecosystems, and we need to know, where they're important, why they're important, when they're important. We need to know about their behavior, where they're going, where they reproduce. And this is actually really hard because we're so limited in the marine environment. A lot of these species are moving long distances, and the question is, how do we keep up with them when you've got sperm whales that can dive a mile or more underwater, some beaked whales holding their breath 2 hours, sharks that never have to come to the surface and swim across oceans. And you know, this is one of the cool things about marine biology for me is sometimes you hear, especially when you talk to little kids, they don't like science because you don't have to be creative. But to be a scientist, you actually have to be just as creative as you do in the arts, just in different ways. And a lot of the creativity comes into designing and developing new technologies. And some of the ones that I have used are up here. And one of the first technologies people developed is what we call acoustic tracking. So basically you put a little bar on an animal. These have been in the news a lot lately. The airplane, the black box, that's basically a mobile black box. So what it does is it just sends out a ping, and we have a hydrophone we can put underwater and listen to that ping and follow the animal and put dots on the map. Eventually, one of a few things will happen. You will run out of gas, you will run out of coffee, or the weather will get really bad, and you have to go back in. So if you're lucky, you can maybe see where an animal's gone for a day or two at a time. And you also just have those dots on a map, but the oceans are three-dimensional. So the next technological development was something called a time depth recorder, where a guy in Antarctica got bored, raided the kitchen, but instead of going for the Spam, he tore apart the kitchen timers, got some glass tubes and built a contraption about this big that he glued to a 2,000-pound whale seal that told him how deep it dove. Now we have these that we can miniaturize with computers, put them on foam floats and suction cups so that you can just kind of launch them onto something like this killer whale, and then it just kind of hangs out on the killer whale just like a remora or a sucker fish for a couple days. Eventually the suction cup loses its suction and the thing floats to the surface, and we can track it down and plug it into the computer to see not just where the animal went, but how deep it was diving, what the temperature was. But we still only have a couple of days window into the lives of these animals, so the next step was to use space. And we have tags called satellite tags that we can put on animals like this tiger shark here. What happens is anytime those tags come to the surface, they send a signal up into space, and then I can be sitting in my office at FIU and get an email that says exactly where that shark is. And so we can follow them kind of all over the world. And some of these satellite tags now have the time depth recorders built into them as well, so we can get information on how deep the animals are swimming and where they're going. But the problem with all of these methods is that we still don't have eyes in the water. We know where animals are going and how they're using their environment, but we don't know what they're doing in certain areas. You know, so you see an animal go and sit on the bottom for a while. It could be sleeping or it could be eating, and it's really important to know which of those it's doing. And so the next cool thing that was developed are called animal-borne video and environmental data systems. National Geographic calls them critter cams. And so these are basically systems that let us go where the animals go, and we get to see what they see from their perspective and get all those data on the environment too. So how many of you guys have a dog? Had a dog growing up, friend with a dog, seen two dogs meet each other in the park? Does it look anything like this turtle meeting another turtle? I know people who have been studying sea turtles for their entire lives, and they never knew they greeted each other by going and having a sniff of the backside. Just like the dogs in the park. We actually recently found out they have another greeting ceremony that's their version of knuckles. They swim like this, and then they just butt heads and keep going. So no idea what they're doing. So you really never know what you're going to see when the animals are running the camera. Of course, the first thing you have to do is to actually get these things on. My favorite way is with a suction cup, which should be easy with a humpback whale. It doesn't always work that way, though. You got your critter cam. You got the guy in the back who's so excited you're about to get the camera on, he forgets to turn on the air tank to actually suck the air out of the cup. But eventually we got it together. And so the humpback whales are easy compared to the pilot whales, which taunt you. They're a lot smaller target, and they'll sit on the bow of the boat swimming along, and they see you with this big giant pole up there, and they know how long it is. When they come to breathe, they go about 1 inch farther than you can reach. Take a breath, and they come right back under you, and they're looking up at you going, sucker. Until one body checks their buddy right into it so you can get it on. But the amazing thing is, these animals don't respond to having the cameras on. I will also admit, unfortunately this will date me, these cameras, the systems you're seeing here were built back in the day where we had these weird things called videotapes that we had to record video on. And so the size of those units was set by the smallest videotape we could make. Now, thanks to these things, my buddy, the engineer who builds these, is about to get us a unit the size of this cell phone that instead of collecting 6 hours of video, will collect 120 hours of high-definition video that we can program to record anytime we want. So pretty soon we're going to be able to put these on animals for weeks at a time, then get them back and have a whole lot more information. But these videos are from back in the old days when we were first designing these systems. You can't use suction cups for sharks because their skin is made up of little scales called dermal denticles that look like teeth, so you can't make a seal on a cup, but they have these built-in camera attachment devices my colleagues would call dorsal fins. So that's our nurse shark in the dry tortugas in the Florida Keys, and then up on top is a tiger shark in Western Australia. And so, you know, you can just attach these, let them go, and then when the computer tells the camera it's time to pop off, that clamp opens up, it floats to the surface, and there's nothing left on the shark. Now, for some seals and turtles with rough shells and with fur, we have to use special glues that dissolve in water so that there's nothing left on the animals. Glues don't really go so well with feathers, so you can do something like a handy-dandy backpack. This looks like my 6-year-old going to school every day. Only Devin's got a much heavier backpack. And that's actually Rodney the stunt penguin. So Rodney lives at a place called Penguin Ranch where there's only one hole in and out of the ice. And so Rodney was actually trained to wear a harness over many days and then to wear blocks, and so, you know, we would never put a camera like this out on that size on a penguin in the wild, but using those cameras and just putting them on for like a half hour at a time, we were able to see that these penguins go way deeper than we thought. They'll dive 500 feet underwater and look up and use silhouettes of the fish on the ice to catch them instead of being shallow divers like we had thought. So, but with the new systems, hopefully the penguin biologists are going to be able to start studying them a lot more. Now, I did mention, you know, these cameras are all designed to pop off and come to the surface where we can track them down. Now, we also have systems that operate on land. Those are a little better because we can actually send video through the air, which we can't do in the oceans. And we can actually send commands to the cameras to tell them things like when to record it, when to fall off. And so we went out to put some of these systems on lions. And you might think, why would you put cameras on lions? I watch National Geographic. All you need is binoculars to study lions. Well, it turns out that those documentaries you see are on these wide open savannas where all you need is binoculars. That's only about 2% of the habitat of Africa. Most of the habitat lions are found in this very dense bushland. So if you were crashing around in your Jeep with binoculars, you'd have some really ticked off lions because you'd be scaring every darn thing they wanted to eat as you're crashing through the bush. So with these cameras on the lions, we're actually able to sit miles away and collect the video as they're moving through the habitat. Now, we were worried about a few things when we put these systems on. One was, you know, how was the lion going to respond to wearing a collar, just like a house cat? Turned out she didn't care. Second thing we were worried about is, you know, in the ocean when the animals feed, we kind of get the lens cleaned for us. How's this going to look after the first zebra? Layla hooked us up. When she cleaned herself, she just cleaned the camera off too. A little slimy, but it worked. Then we wondered what's going to happen when the camera falls off, because there's a little click when it disengages. So we waited until the lions were sitting down. And I triggered the system, and the cubs, who had ignored mom's jewelry for a week, their ears prick up. And they look over, and they figure they have found the world's greatest chew toy. And they gnawed on that thing for 6 hours, the tonsil camera, and drug it through the bush, gnawed on it, and anybody have a cat? What does your cat spend almost all day doing? Yeah, lions can sleep 20 hours a day. So then it was pillow camera. Unfortunately for me, I had the engineer who built this in the van with me going, Mike, go get it! Forget it, man, those are lions! Luckily, they eventually got bored, and with a bit of duct tape, that camera worked and actually went back out again on a lion. So there's a testament to what Beatty does. So, we've got these really cool tools as marine biologists, and probably in the book you read, you heard about what Jacques Cousteau did with inventing a lot of awesome new ways to study the marine environment with scuba. And so we've got all these tools, but what we really need to know is, how important are animals like sharks and ecosystems, and how have humans affected entire ecosystems if we're going to try to restore them and find that balance. And that's what I've been trying to do for the last almost 20 years in a place called Shark Bay, Western Australia. If you turn on CNN, 24 hours a day, you can see a graphic now that will show you Shark Bay, because this very remote part of the world that nobody knew about has gotten a lot of attention recently. And so, I've been going here since 1994, and the reason for that, why I would endure 32 hours of air travel and then an additional 14 hours on the bus, is that it may be, or until a couple of years ago, is kind of the last pristine seagrass ecosystem in the world. And it's the second biggest seagrass ecosystem in the world. Anyone know where the biggest is? Hint, it would only take you a couple hours to get there. Florida Bay and the West Florida Shelf. Now, Shark Bay is in almost the exact same latitude south that we are north. And so Shark Bay gives us a window into what Florida Bay and South Florida might have looked like before people got involved. So it gives us an idea, if we can figure out how this works, we might be able to restore our ecosystems quite a bit. And so one of the major goals of this work is to understand how important it is to have tiger sharks, which are the top predator here. Now, before I talk about this, there's one important thing to learn about predators that I guarantee is in almost zero textbooks. I know it's not in there now. We normally think about how important predators are because of what I like to call the body count. How many prey they can eat, and that's all we're worried about. But it turns out that predators may be more important not because of how much prey they eat, but because of how many prey they scare. Because most animals will do everything they can to not become the next meal. But when an animal is eaten, that leaves more resources for the population that's still behind. So a great example of this was when wolves were restored to the Yellowstone ecosystem. When wolves were driven extinct in the ecosystem in the early 1900s, the elk populations grew, they started eating all the aspen, and the populations of the trees really changed. And that meant less habitat for small mammals, birds, everything else. When wolves were restored to Yellowstone not that long ago, all of a sudden, for the first time in decades, aspen trees started to grow again. We started to see willows along the banks of rivers that stabilized the rivers and provided habitats for things like beavers. And it's not because the wolves all of a sudden ate all the elk. It's because the elk said, forget this, we are not going to be anywhere near the rivers, because if we're there, we're going to get eaten. So because they changed the behavior of the elk, it changed the whole ecosystem. And so this is something people haven't really thought about in the oceans, and one of the things that we've really focused on in Australia. So just to orient you to the place, seagrass everywhere. Most of the areas we're looking are at these shallow banks that are less than 6 feet deep. They're surrounded by deep waters that are down to, say, 30 feet, so not super deep. This is the main seagrass there. We should probably call it a sea bush because it makes so much habitat. And the reason that seagrass is so important is it provides food and shelter for a lot of small fish and invertebrates that grow up to be things we like to catch, or food of things that we like to catch. It's also really important with respect to climate change because seagrasses and mangroves pull a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then it gets buried in the sediment as it dies and the seagrass grows. So keeping intact seagrass ecosystems will help with issues of climate change. Now the seagrass is eaten by Australia's version of a manatee. It's a sea cow called the dugong. You can see they're a little bit smaller than manatees. They pack a much bigger wallop than manatees, I can unfortunately tell you from personal experience. And they have a tail shaped more like a dolphin than a ping pong paddle tail. You also have green sea turtles in Shark Bay, which is the same species we have here in Florida, and both of these are eaten by tiger sharks. Now, tiger sharks are awesome, officially. They get to be 15 to 18 feet long, but once they get to be 10 feet long, for about every inch in length, it feels like they put about an inch across their head. So once you get about a 12, 13-foot tiger shark, I feel like I could probably get my shoulders in that mouth without getting scraped up too much. So they're really built to eat big prey. They also, instead of having teeth that are narrow and pointy and meant for kind of grabbing and holding on to prey like most sharks, those teeth are curved and serrated, so they can grab onto a sea turtle, shake their head, and cut right through the shell. Now, if you're a tiger shark and you've done this, you have a problem. You've got all that yummy turtle meat, but what else have you got in your stomach? Have no fear, they've got it all sorted. I am sorry they scheduled me before lunch. They can leave that in their stomach until they've digested all the good parts. Then they can turn their stomach inside out through their mouth. You see this little pink bag? Shell falls out and they just go suck their stomach back down and they're ready to go again. How awesome is that? You know, tiger sharks also like spaghetti. I mean, sea snakes. Spaghetti, you know, just slurp it down. And it turns out that a lot of these sea snakes, these fish called snake eels that burrow in the ground, so the sea snakes will put their heads down in the burrows to try to get the snake eels. So almost all the sea snakes that we find in the tiger shark's stomachs are bitten off right behind the head when they had their head in the sand. And even though these sea snakes are some of the most venomous animals on the planet, the tiger sharks can break that down in their stomachs, no problem. Tiger sharks also go after stingrays, seabirds, and attack a lot of the dolphins. About 75% of the dolphins in Shark Bay have scars and wounds from where they've been bitten by sharks. And probably about 12% of the population's attacked every year. Not sure if he's the luckiest or most unlucky dolphin, but Smokey's been attacked 9 different times. But he's still out there. And just to round it out, these guys like to eat fish. So what we're trying to do is figure out what would happen to Shark Bay if you took the tiger sharks out. Because that's pretty much what we've done in places like Florida. And we've also taken out the big grazers like dugongs and turtles. So how do we do this? The first thing we do is, I guess maybe it's because I like to eat, we go out and we figure out where the food for everything is. So we go out and we survey the seagrasses by using satellite photographs, collecting seagrasses to see how much nutrients are in them. We use traps to catch the fish. We also now use, you guys know those GoPro cameras? Those things have revolutionized science because cameras that 8 years ago cost me $4,000 to have custom made, I can now go to Best Buy or Amazon and get them for like $300. And so now we actually seed the bay with these video cameras to record what's going on with the fish populations without having to catch them and just kind of observing them. Over the years, we've driven enough miles along these set lines, counting animals, to have driven around the world at the equator at least once, maybe twice. So we really have a good idea of how many animals are there. Now, to sample the sharks, we go out. See, this is where you start, helping the camera guy out. Normally we go out before sunrise, but he doesn't like that because he can't see it. So when the camera guy's there, you go out when there's light. But the idea is we go out and set 10 lines in Shark Bay. Each line has about a pound of Australian salmon on it. Don't worry, no relation to the North American salmon. It tastes awful, so we're not wasting good food. There were no mutinies from the assistants when we started putting Australian salmon on the lines. We leave those lines out for just a couple of hours. We check them every 2 hours. And on a good day, on 10 lines, we will have 7 sharks around 10 feet long on average. To put that in perspective, in Hawaii, they think there's still a lot of sharks. They'll put out 100 hooks for 18 hours and maybe catch 6 or 7 that average 7 feet long. So there are a ton of tiger sharks in Shark Bay. Once we've got them, we can collect blood samples that help us figure out what they've been eating. We can attach the cameras, satellite tags, whatever we need, and then let them go. We were hoping we'd be able to put some lines in the shallow and deep waters to see whether they like the seagrass or the deeper waters. We couldn't do that because of that animal in the corner. If you put your lines in the shallow water, we actually put cameras on our lines to see why we were never getting any sharks in the shallows. It turns out within 10 minutes, these guys come along and eat all your bait. And tiger sharks only occasionally eat bear hooks. So that's why we started the critter cam work. Now to study the turtles, we want to get our hands on them. So this is really easy. You just need a really good boat driver who doesn't care if they knock the person in front off the boat. And that's my wife Linda, who is she earned the nickname Schumacher. Any racing fans? Big race car driver because she's crazy, but the best turtle driver. And then you just jump off and grab the turtle and try to hold on.
Do not do this at home.
Yeah, you have to have a permit to do this and stuff. But it's kind of like extreme sport meets science. I hate my job. Whenever I'm down there, it's like, students, sorry guys, I get this. When I'm gone, you can do the turtle catching. But the nice thing once you have these turtles is we can weigh them so we can get a sense of what kind of condition they're in, whether they're really healthy or whether they're close to starvation. And then we can put sensors on them as well. And it turns out these data were really important because we recently had a big seagrass die-off in Shark Bay, so we've been able to track the turtle population health before and after that. So it is a science talk, so I'm required in some contract somewhere to show at least one graph. So here's your graph. This just shows 10 years of shark catches and just shows you how we're able to figure out how important sharks are. Basically all you need to know is red is when it's warm, blue is when it's cold. And what you see is in these warm months, there are tons of tiger sharks here. In the winters, even though we put the same amount of effort into catching sharks, we have some winters where we see no sharks, other winters where we see intermediate numbers. You also see some winters with really high abundance of sharks and others with low. So we're able to look at the behavior and dynamics of the bay in periods of different amounts of sharks that isn't just winter, summer. So we can kind of correct for reproductive seasons and other water temperature. And what we've been able to see is that having sharks in the bay completely changes how the animals they might eat are behaving. So when there are no sharks in the bay, the dolphins spend almost all their time feeding in the shallow waters where most of the food is. When the sharks show up, most of the dolphins say, forget this. I'm going to go feed where there's almost no fish, but I'm not going to get eaten by a shark. So they move out to the deep waters because the sharks love the shallow waters. That's where they're spending most of their time. Now you will notice there are a few dolphins still hanging out in those shallow waters where there's a high reward but a high risk. Would anyone like to venture a guess on what kind of dolphins those are, what characteristics they might have? Hint, it's not stupid, I don't think. Any aspiring teachers in high school here? It's the juvenile males. They're the ones that take all the risks, but probably get more fish. Sorry guys, it's a pattern. The dugongs do the same thing. When there are no sharks around, they're feeding in the shallows where the seagrass is. When the sharks show up, they spend a lot more time in the deep. Now they can't pretty much abandon the shallow waters like the dolphins can because they still have to eat something, so they go in and they basically spend all their time feeding around the edges. The other cool thing that these dugongs do is they change from being sea pigs to sea cows. If the dugongs had their way, and what they do when there are no sharks around, they like to dig down under the sediment and eat the stems of the seagrass that are under the bottom. That's where most of the really nutritious stuff is. But that creates this huge plume of mud, which means that the sharks know where the dugong is. The dugong's kind of ringing the dinner bell saying, here I am, and putting on a blindfold so they don't know where the shark's coming. So when the sharks show up, they stop doing this feeding where they dig up the bottom, and instead they crop the leaves off the seagrass, which isn't as good. Now you can see that changing from digging up the sediment to cropping the leaves is probably going to have a really big effect on the seagrass itself, right? Pulling out the roots is going to change the structure of the seagrass beds in a way that just eating the leaves won't. And so we've been putting these big cages out to look at how changes in where the herbivores feed because of the sharks being there, how that affects the seagrass. And what we've basically been able to determine from all this work is that you really need to have healthy populations of sharks to have healthy seagrass beds. And that's because if you lose sharks, and we're starting to see this in some places in Indonesia and in Bermuda, when you lose sharks and you protect turtles, the turtle populations explode. And they can actually eat themselves out of house and home, the same with those sea cows. So if you don't have sharks, it might be good for those turtles for a while, but they can actually eventually drive those seagrasses extinct in small areas. And then what are the turtles going to do? Probably going to starve. Or they're going to have to move somewhere else. So this means that we're actually having to change the entire conversation around sharks to protecting what's little bits are left to maybe we actually need to restore populations of sharks in some areas to keep the balance of these ecosystems. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, but having your predators around is actually good for you long term because it keeps the populations kind of balanced. Also, which of these meadows do you think is going to be better for people? The one with lots of seagrass and habitat and carbon being captured? Or sandy bottoms? Because what's going to happen to any fish or invertebrate on a sandy bottom? It's going to get found and get eaten pretty quick, right? So it turns out that having sharks in at least seagrass ecosystems like Shark Bay is probably very good for people in fisheries too. So something to think about. So let's make a little transition here. We'll go through this kind of fast. Talk about the Everglades and some predators here. You guys probably hear a fair bit about the Everglades, and right now we're in the middle of a massive ecosystem restoration on the order of $8 billion to try to get the water right, basically, the quantity, quality, and timing of water. Because we went from a situation where we used to have tons of water flowing over Lake Okeechobee into the southern Everglades, but now we basically take that fresh water and dump it into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, which has all kinds of bad effects for those coastal ecosystems. You might have heard about the algal blooms in the Indian River Lagoon area, maybe driven by too much fresh water going in. And so we're trying to use canals and removing levees to get more water flowing into the southern Everglades. It's good for the ecosystem, but ultimately it's good for people too, because that's drinking water for an expanding human population. So this is another example where we can do something that's good for the people and good for the environment at the same time. Now the place where I'm working and a lot of my colleagues at Florida International University is in a part of the Everglades that people don't know a lot about that we call the coastal Everglades. And this is where you go from those sawgrass marshes and it starts to hit the ocean water and you get mangrove trees. And this is a really important part of the Everglades because it's a refuge for a lot of the fish species that the birds rely on and that people like to catch when the marsh dries out. So in the dry season, huge areas of the Everglades go from being shallow water to being totally dry. One of the places that fish can go are into these mangrove estuaries. So you get tons of these little fish moving off the marsh, and then you get the big predators people like to catch, like largemouth bass and snook, following them to catch the food. The other predator that we see in this area that you might not expect is the bull shark. Bull sharks can actually survive in completely fresh water. There's a population in Lake Nicaragua that probably some individuals almost never go to the ocean, and you have them even reproducing probably in the fresh water. Here in the coastal Everglades, it's mainly the little guys we see, maybe 1 to 5 years old, in that fresh water, which is a great place to be because there are not many bigger sharks that can eat you, which is why they're there. And so we've been studying the sharks, the alligators, and based on a picture I got from one of my students yesterday of a 10-foot long python, we may have to start working on them soon too. Didn't think we'd see pythons swimming around in the salt water, but we did. And so we've been looking at areas all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to about 30 kilometers upstream. So how do we study the sharks? We take what we call long lines. It's a rope that's about 1,800 feet long and made with small chunks of mullet. Leave it out there for about an hour, and then we get these guys. Aren't they cute? That one's probably about 2 months old. And what we can do is get them in the cooler, measure them, take blood samples to see whether they've been eating in the oceans or the fresh water. And then we can implant a transmitter in them that will last for 4 years. So we can follow their movements anywhere they go. And the amazing thing is that after the surgery, this is less than 1 week later. It's pretty much completely healed. And the amazing thing is how fast sharks heal. Those tiger sharks that we put the satellite tags on, once they fall out, a few weeks later, you can't even tell there was ever a tag on them. Which does make sense. Sharks, the male grabs onto the female with you know, it leaves pretty big scars, so you better heal pretty quickly. And so we can follow the sharks for years. We also work on the alligators. To catch those, you just go out at night and you find the eye shine with a spotlight, drive up to them and slip a rope over and hold on. Then we get another a snare over the mouth to secure it. Then you use lots of tape. And it turns out alligator jaws are really strong closing but not opening, so a few wraps of electrical tape will keep them shut. Then we can pull them in the boat, attach transmitters to them, collect blood. My student Adam Rosenblatt, we've actually been flushing the stomachs to see exactly what they're eating. We found out if you push a little too hard to get the water to come out, it will actually launch into Adam's lap. And then nobody wants to be on the boat with him the rest of the trip, because it smells as bad as you would think. And then once we let these animals go, we have monitoring stations all over the bay. And so as the alligators or sharks swim by, every time they come by, we know exactly what animal it was, because each pinger has an individual code, and what time they went through. So we can see how they move up and down the estuary over really long periods of time. So what we've found is that these bull sharks tend to spend 3 to 5 years in the estuary. We've actually found that the populations on the Gulf of Mexico are even linked to areas up here in Jupiter, because when we downloaded our monitors, we actually got a code from a tag that was put in by a friend of ours off Jupiter Beach. And one of their bull sharks, which was probably a pregnant female, swam all the way around the bottom of Florida, went up into the river, spent, I think it was like 18 hours there, and then swam out. So we see these populations linked over big areas. Turns out life isn't super easy as a baby bull shark. Changes in oxygen levels, salinity, and especially temperature are really hard. And in fact, we had that cold snap back in 2010. Every single bull shark in the population of these little guys either died or left the estuary, and only one ever came back. So once they got out in the ocean, they probably had to run the gauntlet of bigger sharks. Now, one of the cool things that we found is that, you know, they have what you might call personalities. We've got different types of bull sharks in this population, even though they're the same size, same sex. Some individuals, they're shyer, they're not very exploratory, and they'll spend their entire time way up here, far away from the ocean, where there's not a lot of food, and they'll spend years up there, not leaving that area. Other bull sharks are very exploratory, and they'll swim from that kind of inland bay all the way to the coastal ocean, and then back up, and they'll go back and forth and back and forth. And they're eating almost exclusively in the oceans where there's a lot more food, but it's also a lot more dangerous because they're the big sharks there. And so these two groups of sharks are playing very different roles in the environment. You know, those ones that are moving up and down could be moving nutrients upstream and are kind of linking what's happening in the oceans to what's happening in the estuaries. And the cool thing is that we're seeing the same thing with the alligators. You know, one of the first things we found is we saw these huge reptiles. We thought they'd be big turtles, you know, big fish. And it turns out they're eating crabs, crayfish, snails, anchovies that big, and pond apples. That surprised us. Vegetarian, you know, partially vegetarian alligators. Some of them had, you know, the record was like 2,000 seeds from pond apples in its stomach. And the other thing is that we see that these alligators, we seem to have like the couch potatoes and the commuters. So this is 2 alligators. This is 3 months of data from 2 alligators that we put a satellite tag on. They tagged, I think, one night apart, one here, one right there. So just a couple hundred yards apart. One alligator did a total of 7 kilometers of traveling in 3 months, which probably a lot of that's error in the GPS signal. It's kind of like maybe running not even a marathon around a flagpole. The other alligator at the same time traveled hundreds of kilometers. It would swim down to the ocean, spend 18 hours in the ocean, swim back to the freshwater, spend time there, then swim back down and back up and back down. And it turns out that about a third of the population are these commuting alligators that are really important in linking the oceans to upstream areas. Now, why don't they just stay down in the ocean? Alligators are the only crocodilian that don't have a functioning salt gland. So they basically have to move back up to the freshwater to get the salt out of their body, or they won't survive. So very cool things. Just a couple more things to leave you with here. These are some examples of work I've done, but it turns out when we look around the oceans, we're seeing a lot of other places where sharks and other predators matter. It looks like off the east coast of the U.S., when we started to overfish large sharks, we had stingray populations explode. And this has caused or helped exacerbate collapses in shellfish populations because the rays eat so much of them. In coral reefs, what we see, reefs that have bigger sharks and more sharks tend to have healthier corals. Now we just need to do the work to know if that's because of the sharks or if sharks just happen to stay in areas where they're healthier corals, but we seem to see that. This is a cool example, these big sleeper sharks in Alaska. It turns out their presence changes the behavior of harbor seals from feeding on herring or from feeding on pollock, which are big high-energy fish that people catch in fisheries, to herring, which are another important fishery species. So, as we look around, we see that we need to learn a lot more about sharks and probably need to make sure we're doing a lot better job protecting them. Now, as I got to this idea of really needing to protect sharks, what I really started to realize is that we need to be starting looking in different areas, because a lot of times scientists can go out, we can look at a problem, we can analyze what the likely outcomes are in different scenarios, and propose ways that we can fix things, even if we take economics and policy into account. But often we don't get to the solutions we need to, and a lot of it comes down to inspiring the public or kids to care enough about these things. Especially when we get to elementary school, and my kids are, they are guilty of this, they would much rather play Angry Birds or Minecraft than get outside, even though if you force them to go outside, they love it. And so a lot of my work now has been not just on research, but trying to figure out ways to inspire the public, and especially kids, not just to become scientists, but to have enough interest to care about it, to maybe think about it when they're voting or in their own daily habits. So, we've been trying to find ways to bring the field to kids, because back when I was a kid, we were outside all the time, and that just doesn't happen as much anymore in the K-12 realm. And so my friend Patrick, who's the director of photography for Jeff Corwin's show on ABC, Ocean Mysteries, have been trying to come up with ways to get kids inspired about the environment. And we'll skip this video actually, because it's I've been talking a long time, but we can maybe look at it later. But we've been basically, you guys are probably too young to choose your own adventure books. You guys ever do that? So basically what we're doing is creating videos that treat the kids like they're part of our science teams. We take them with us, they come up with their own ideas, and then answer the questions themselves instead of us telling them. Okay, so we won't worry about that video. But I will leave you with one thing that ties fairly specifically, I think, to the book you read. The book you read, did you guys read about the conch shelf expedition? Is that in there?
Yep. Yeah.
What was the conch shelf expedition? I don't have a test till 2 days from now, so I can read it tonight. Or wait, this is a dang public lecture. There was not supposed to be a test. Okay, I'll give you my version. Conch shelf was basically Jacques Cousteau's attempt to live underwater. Because one of the problems with scuba diving is that we get such a small window into the oceans. Depending on how deep you're diving, you may get 20 minutes, 30 minutes, if you're lucky, maybe an hour underwater before you have to come up, sit on your boat, get sprayed in the face and seasick, and then go back down for maybe another 20 or 30 minutes. So you maybe get an hour and a half, if you're really lucky, 2 hours of diving in a day. And so you don't have time to be underwater and appreciate it. So Cousteau wanted to say, what would we do if we could live underwater? And we let our bodies kind of come into equilibrium with the gas pressure around us. Because if you do that, then you can spend all day outside. You can spend 9 or 10 hours underwater scuba diving. The trick with that is that when you get to the end and you want to come to the surface, you have to get sealed in a pressure chamber and slowly bring the pressure down to what you have at the surface. And after Cousteau's mission, they were 30 days that the team was in there. And there were a few of these habitats that popped up around the world, but most of them didn't make it. And it turns out now there is only one research habitat left in the entire world. And it just so happens that that habitat's operated by FIU in the Florida Keys, and it's called Aquarius Reef Base. And that's what it is. It's basically a school bus-sized tin can with a lot more high-tech stuff on it. It's about 5 miles offshore of Key Largo, and it's been there for 20 years, right on the coral reef, and it really gives you the gift of time. So in a 10-day mission to Aquarius, you can do as much research as 6 months probably of going in and out from boats. And you can do research you just cannot do on normal scuba diving because you can be out there for long periods of time. It's easy to dive at night. And so this is actually a picture from an all-student mission that was done in November. So here's how it works. Basically, we have a buoy that floats over the habitat. It has a generator and a compressor on it. That powers battery banks that are on the habitat and big air canisters. So the habitat itself, if that buoy were to disappear, which it won't because it's moored very well, the habitat has many days of air and power in and of itself. So it's self-sufficient if you need to do repairs on the buoy. When you're inside the habitat, you can transport supplies in and out with what we call these pods. This is kind of a medium-sized one. So basically, you just throw your cell phone, everything in there, seal it up, and take it down. And then you enter the habitat through what's called the wet porch. So basically, there's just a hole in the bottom of the habitat on one side, but because it's sealed, the air doesn't have anywhere to go, so the water can't come in. It's kind of like if you take a cup and turn it upside down in the sink. The water, you can push it down and keep the air in it. It's the same deal. You walk up out of the wet porch, take a nice warm shower, dry off, and then you can step into the habitat. It kind of looks like the space station with all the tech that's in there to run the habitat itself. So whenever there's a team in there, there are 2 technicians in the habitat all the time. And that's like the best window ever at a breakfast table, I think, which doubles as the lab bench. So you've got the kitchen, workstation, shower. You actually have high-speed internet and a phone down there. You can go down there and call home. Hey, hon, guess where I am? Or, one of the cool things is we do a lot of Skype with classrooms across the country. So in our last mission, we talked to 30 different classrooms from Washington to the Virgin Islands, just talking to kids live so they can talk to an aquanaut. And it turns out there have been less aquanauts, people who have gone underwater to do this, than there are astronauts. So it's a pretty unique group. We have a land base in the Keys where we have 24-hour-a-day communication and video links to the habitat. And then usually when we have the people living underwater, we have science teams coming out all the time to kind of provide extra surface divers. Before anyone goes in, there's about 5 to 10 days of training when you're down there. And it's used by all kinds of people, and this is the cool thing. So marine scientists from all over the world use it for studying coral reefs, which are important to know about because they're worth billions of dollars of economic value to people every year, but are also threatened. It's also actually used by NASA a lot to train astronauts because it's the only place in the world where you can have an extreme environment that simulates what goes on in space. So it's good for them to come down and run missions and try things underwater in an Aquarius before you send them up into space. And you can actually still set up systems where they'll simulate landings and other things, spacewalks that are going to happen actually outside the habitat. And then we also have it as in kind of ocean observatory. One of our recent missions was looking at the effects of overfishing on coral reefs, studies to figure out what's the best way to restore coral reefs. And for me, the exciting thing, if anyone thinks this is cool, we have a website where you have streaming videos. So when there are missions on there, you can watch what's going on all the time. And we've got our classroom project. And here's the big link back to the book you read. Starting, I think it is June 2nd, Fabien Cousteau, Jacques' grandson, is going to be doing a 31-day mission to Aquarius as the 50th anniversary of the conch shell mission his grandfather did. But of course, he's going to go one day longer. So that's mission 31, and you'll be able to watch that mission. Will be streamed live 24 hours a day, starting in June. And along with Fabian and the Habitat, we're going to have 2 graduate students from FIU and 2 graduate students from Northeastern University kind of running the science teams while we're there. So there's lots of cool stuff out there, and I have to send a big shout out to all the people I worked with that helped contribute the information I told you about. And in case you were wondering, that is not Santa Claus. That's my graduate advisor Larry, but he does play one at the Christmas party. So this is the crew from Australia, and also a fantastic crew here in Florida. And thank you everybody for being here, and happy